I think my grandfather might be a serial killer by Verastahl. I don't have the best memory of my childhood. Not that my childhood was bad. It wasn't. But I just don't remember that much of it compared to a lot of people. My grandfather always stood out to me, which was strange because he was never around very much. The few times that he came around for Christmas or some other family occasion, he seemed a kind but serious man. I remember him talking to me and showing me coin tricks, and I liked the sound of his deep rumbling voice as he told me stories about far-off lands and fantastic creatures. I remembered liking him and feeling sorry for him because underneath it all, he seemed very sad and tired. I knew that my grandmother had died not long before I was born, so I always imagined that was a lot of why he was sad. I say this all to explain that I had a limited but positive idea of my grandfather before a few days ago. Last month, my parents were killed in a car accident coming back from a movie. I live 2 states away, but as their only child and closest relatives, I got the call. The next few hours were a haze of travel and crying and shock, but I know that when I got to the hospital, my grandfather was there. Even as an adult, I was amazed at how large a man he was. And when he swept me up in his quiet hug, I cried against him for several minutes, welcoming the comfort. We did the funeral arrangements together and agreed that we would come back in a few weeks to go through all of their things and get the house ready to sell. He'd already made clear that regardless of whether they had a will or not, he wanted everything to go to me, but he would be happy to help and get to know his grandson a little better. The funerals went well, as far as those kind of things go, and I went back to my life. Last week, I got a call from my grandfather, and we agreed to meet up this past weekend to start going through all of their belongings. I got to the house on Sunday morning, and the last couple of days have been a bit sad at times, but they've been a lot of fun as well. My grandfather is much like I remember him, a serious but kind man that enjoys talking and telling stories. And he has actual conversations with you rather than just taking turns monologuing, which is a rare commodity in my experience with older people or people in general nowadays. He wanted to know about my work, if I had a girlfriend, if I liked the area I lived in. He told me some about his days in the army as a medic, and then his time as a doctor. I knew he had been a pretty famous surgeon at one point, but that mostly stopped after his wife died. He still had a small practice and would sometimes publish academic articles, but he had saved much of the money from his early career as a surgeon, so he was comfortable enough financially that he could do what he wanted for the most part. Much of our time was spent busy and in separate parts of the house or garage, so we would largely talk at meals and in the evening hours before bed. By the second night, we were more comfortable with each other, and that's when my grandfather started talking about his wife. Even now, some 30 years after her death, it was clear how much he loved her and missed her. He started off by telling a story that involved her only peripherally, but soon he was just telling things about her. Funny stories. Tales that illustrated how smart or good she was. Little sayings she used to have. It was sentimental, but it was so genuine and heartfelt that I wasn't uncomfortable. Seeing how much he loved her made me love both of them more. I had no sooner finished that thought when his expression turned darker. Like a ship entering sudden storms. He started talking about how she was taken from him, how that man, that thing had killed her. I just listened, but internally I was wondering where all this was coming from. As far as I knew, my grandmother had been killed by a drunk driver. Wow. That was terrible. He was making it sound like it was something else, like she had been intentionally murdered in some way. It was all pretty vague, but I could still see when he realized he was saying something more than he intended. He looked embarrassed and apologized for rambling on, making some passing remark about how he had become the old man at the mall that will talk for hours about nothing. I laughed and was going to reassure him that I was enjoying it, but he was already on his feet and looking at his watch. He had to be going, he said. Had to run into town to take care of a couple of things before it got too late, but he'd see me in the morning. I found this all very strange for a couple of reasons. First, we had just gone to town earlier that day and bought supplies and groceries to last at least a couple more days. Second, it was nearing 10 o'clock. And aside from a gas station or bar, I doubted much would be open in the closest town, which was relatively small and a good 30 minutes away. Still, he was a grown man and my elder, and it was none of my business where he went or what he did. Maybe he just wanted to go off and be by himself after talking about his wife so much. In any case, I said good night and he headed out. A minute later, I heard his giant SUV rumble to life outside and trundle its way out into the night. I went to bed. But though I was tired, I had trouble falling asleep. Part of it was sleeping in a strange place. This house had not been our house when I was growing up. So aside from visits, I had never slept here for long. Part of it was worrying about my grandfather. My bed was next to a window on the upper floor. So periodically, I would peek out to see if I saw any sign of his return. The moon wasn't full but was still bright enough to shine off the lawn and the trees that grew thick as they became woods and then forest. It was beautiful and I knew my parents had loved it here. Still, it was too remote for my taste, and if they hadn't lived so far out of town, they probably wouldn't have gotten killed coming back from a movie. The thought made me angry, so I pushed it aside. Picking up my tablet, I started reading, and before I knew it, I was asleep. I'm not sure if it was the rumbling engine, the squeak of my grandfather's driver's side door, or some internal sense that something had changed. But I woke up sometime later and looked out the window again. I saw my grandfather standing at the rear of his SUV looking around for several seconds before opening the back hatch. At first, I couldn't see anything due to the angle. But when he reached in and started pulling out the body, I saw more than I wanted. It was a woman. And as I watched, he pulled her out enough to pick her up in his arms and began carrying her into the trees. I know it was nighttime and there was a distance of probably 50 yards, but I could see it all very clearly. And with her hanging arms and lolling head, it was also clear that the woman was either deeply unconscious or dead. I felt panic well up in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I call 911? What if I had been mistaken or he was trying to help her? Maybe she was drunk. But if he was trying to help her, wouldn't he either carry her to a hospital or at least brought her inside rather than carrying her into the woods? It was all so strange. And the longer he was gone out of sight, the less real it seemed. So I did nothing. I sat by the window, looking out for a number of minutes, and then just when I was about to give up, he came back into view, empty-handed and picking his way between the trees as he approached the car. He shut the back hatch on the SUV with a shake of his head and then looked up right at where I sat in the window. When I first saw the body, I had been careful to stay low and slightly back from the window, but time and shock had led to me paying less attention to how visible I was as I waited for him to return. And there was no doubt that he saw me now. As if to confirm it, he lifted his hand and gave a small wave. Feeling a strange combination of embarrassment and horror, I waved back. As I'm writing this, it's the next morning and I've spent the last several hours deciding what to do or say to him while listening out for the slightest creak of the floor or turn of the knob. He may not know I saw the woman and I guess there could be some benign explanation, though that seems unlikely at this point. Either way, I hear and smell him cooking breakfast and he's going to be knocking on my door soon. I love my grandfather, but I don't trust him. Not anymore. I think I'm going to try to talk to him, but at the first sign of trouble, I'm out the door. If I have more to report and am able to do so, I'll write again soon. I left off while I was still upstairs trying to decide what to do. I had considered just waiting for my grandfather to come up and get me for breakfast. But the idea of him in the doorway of the only exit from the room made me very nervous. I wound up just getting dressed, putting my keys and wallet in one pocket and a small folding knife in the other, and heading downstairs. He was still at the stove when I entered the kitchen, and despite my fear, I could feel my stomach grumble at the smell of eggs, bacon, and coffee that permeated the air. Not that I could trust eating any of it, but my stomach wasn't concerned with trivial matters like rat poison and antifreeze. He turned and gave me a nod as I made my way to the table. "Good morning. I was gonna come up and get you in a few minutes. Hope you're hungry." "Nah. Not too much," I lied. "My stomach has been weird this morning, so I think I'm gonna have to wait." "Smells great though." I sat down in a chair where I could face him and reached the door outside or the living room quickly if things went south. He nodded his head and kept on poking at the eggs. "Well, that's a shame, but it'll be here for you if you feel up to it a bit later." He set the pan of eggs on an unlit burner and turned to face me, his expression slightly concerned. "Don't think you're getting sick, do you?" I shook my head, weighing different lies and excuses. But finally, I decided this was as good of an opportunity as I was going to get to broach the topic of what I had seen the night before. I've just been a bit worried since last night. I saw you when you came back last night." My grandfather was nodding already, but I pushed on. "I saw all of it. Not just when you came back from the woods. I saw the woman you had." His expression didn't change at first, but after turning off the stove and taking a seat across the table from me, I saw a mixture of worry and sadness on his face. "I thought you most likely had, and I know how something like that must look. I didn't want to frighten you by approaching you about it. And if I'm honest, I was hoping you had missed the first part, not the way I wanted you to find out about all this." He rubbed his mouth and gave a nervous smile. "Still, I was half afraid you'd be gone when I got up this morning or that there'd be police out there. I know you can't trust me right now, but giving me the chance to explain means a lot to me." I nodded. His words were said in an even and reasonable tone, but I couldn't help but feel a dull dread growing in my stomach. A part of me had hoped he would deny everything and convince me it was a dream or mistake. Instead, he was confirming that it happened. And I'd be lying if I said he wasn't intimidating even in his kindest moments. He was very intelligent and half a foot taller than me. And the last couple of days had been proof enough that age had slowed him very little. Last night, he had carried that woman without any signs of real effort, carried her lifeless body out into the dark, come back to me. "I know this is frightening. I can tell you that you have no reason to be afraid of me. But how much is that worth right now?" "Very little, I suspect. So let me explain as best I can. All I ask is that you listen to the entire thing. And if at the end of it, if you want to call the police or leave or whatever you think is best, I will fully cooperate. But I need you to hear the entire thing because some of it is going to sound very strange at first. Okay?" I leaned back in my chair, my head pounding. This was the point where I had to make a decision to give him a chance or not, whether to risk myself even more or not. On the one hand, I could run and call the cops. On the other, I could hear him out, and in theory, still do that if I didn't like or believe what he told me. Still, where did we put the tape? When he raised an eyebrow, I shrugged. "I'll hear you out, but I want you taped to that chair before we start. I can't risk this being a trick or you deciding it's not going your way and you want to attack me." I could see the hurt in his eyes, but I pushed past it. "I want to believe you, to trust you, but you know it's the smart thing to do on my end." He nodded. "It is. I'm proud of you for thinking of it. I just hate it comes to that. But that's my fault, not yours. It's in the living room, I think on the table by the sofa." Standing up slowly, I backed into the living room and grabbed the tape, fearful for the 5 seconds he was out of sight. But he was waiting in the same spot when I came back in, and he sat still while I put layers of tape around his chest and arms, securing him firmly to the back of the wooden chair he sat in. Pausing for a moment to consider, I then wrapped the remaining tape around his ankles and the front chair legs just to be safe. The job done, I asked him if he was comfortable enough. When he said he was, I sat back down across from him, my hands sweaty and slightly shaking as I tried to give him a comforting smile. Sorry again, but I'm ready to hear everything you want to tell me. My grandfather looked off in the distance for a moment before focusing his dark blue eyes on me. Your mama told you that my wife died in a car wreck. A drunk driver. Right? I nodded. Yeah. She said she was killed going to visit you at the hospital. You had been working on a patient for hours and she was bringing you some dinner. Dark anger flickered across his face, disappearing as he shook his head. Well, the last part was right. I had been working on a girl who had been shot in a hunting accident since early afternoon. The girl wound up living. But my sweet girl, your grandmother, she didn't get killed by a drunk driver. She was taken as she was getting out of her car at the hospital, brutalized and torn apart, with what was left of her being found in a field 10 miles away. His voice grew rough and crackled with emotion as he spoke. I didn't even know anything was wrong at first, but someone found the covered dish she was bringing me in the parking lot dropped and broken. They figured out it was her car, and then they came to me. I had just finished the surgery an hour earlier, but still had another 5 hours on my shift. So I went to take a nap, thinking she would wake me up when she got there. Instead, it was one of the admins asking if I had seen my wife that evening. He spread his hands out on the table, long-fingered and steady even at his age. Staring at them, he continued, Your grandmother was a smart woman, a good woman. Sure, things were safer back then than they are now, but it wasn't like no one ever got hurt or killed. Even in a smaller town like we lived in, it happened. But she had no real enemies, and she was always careful when she traveled anywhere. My point is that no one would have easily gotten a jump on her. The police said at first that it could just be a misunderstanding or she could have just decided to leave, as stupid as that sounded. I spent all night looking for her, terrified and half out of my mind. By the next morning, the police were there with me. It was just before noon when they found her body in that field. I made the mistake of going to the scene. I told myself that I was used to blood, to everything a body could show, and that I owed it to her to see how she died. It was beyond anything, I imagine. One arm and the opposite leg had been torn completely off, and her torso had been stretched to such a degree that, well, it didn't look like a person at all. And that was actually better because it made it seem unreal. But then I saw her long, light brown hair. I'd always loved her hair so much, and even attached to the shattered ruin of her face, I knew it anywhere. It was remarkably clean compared to the rest, as though someone or something had taken great care not to mess up or soil that pretty hair. That thought is what broke me, I think. I don't remember much for the few days that followed. I know I was at her funeral, but I couldn't tell you anything about it. When I finally resurfaced from whatever stupor I was in, I was sitting at home with my brother and his wife. They were trying to keep me company. We were watching TV, I think. I wanted to scream at them, to yell and make them understand that this was all pointless now, that my life was over, that everything was over. So why were they trying to prolong things? Instead, I just told them that I appreciated their help and attention, but that I knew they needed to be getting back home and I needed time to myself. They wasted little time in packing and heading out. I spent the next day or so weighing various methods of suicide. I really had no interest in living in a world without her. I believe in God, and I think suicide is a shame and likely a sin when done for such selfish reason. But I was to a point that I didn't care. I didn't care if I went to hell for it. I felt like I deserved it for letting this happen to her, but this led me down the path of dwelling on what had happened to her and what had caused it. Who had caused it? I set aside my idea of pills and ropes and self-inflicted gunshot wounds, got a shower and a shave, and I went down to the police station. Over the next few weeks, I continued to harass and harangue them, pushing them to do more while understanding there was little likely more they could do. They had looked for witnesses. There were none. They had looked for evidence of how the attack was committed and had only come up with injuries caused by indeterminate blunt and serrated objects. There were no cameras at the hospital until 3 years later, and this was before the age of cell phones to track. After bullying them with a threatened lawsuit, I obtained copies of all their photos and reports. I pored through them, but found little more of note. The parking lot was paved, so there were no tire tracks to follow, and no tire or shoe tracks had been found near the field where she was killed. Something about the parking lot stuck out to me, but I wasn't sure what it was at first. After 2 days of looking at everything, it hit me. The hospital had a separate parking lot for doctors and surgical staff that was blocked by a mechanical arm and a keypad. Rebecca had the passcode, so she had parked there when she was taken. The parking lot was on the far rear of the hospital, not visible from the road and without any hospital roads or paths that would make it a thoroughfare for a casual passerby. What were the odds that someone had just happened upon her as they went by or decided to wait in a relatively small and quiet parking lot for hours until they had a chance to snatch someone? I decided it seemed unlikely. In retrospect, I know it was certainly possible I could have been wrong. But at the time, I needed answers, and I decided focusing on someone who worked in the hospital and or had access to the parking lot like my wife was the best course of action. Among all the complaints I might have had about the investigation of Rebecca's murder, I would never have made it farther without them. One of the detectives had pulled the tissue sample from under her fingernails and had sent it to be tested if they ever got something to compare it to. Understand this was 1986, and DNA testing was brand new. It wasn't even an option at the state crime labs at the time, and the likelihood of that sample ever being of use was small to none. But I still had to actually file a lawsuit to get the sample back so I could send it to Daniel Church, a friend of mine from med school that had gone on to work at one of the foremost labs for DNA in the country. He couldn't do tests for me officially, but he knew what I was going through and agreed to help as much as he could in an unofficial capacity. The main thing that he needed was viable samples from a suspect for comparison. Fortunately, that was the easy part. Hospital policy required all operating room doctors and staff to have semi-annual blood work both as a check for any substance abuse issues as well as a screening mechanism for any potential infectious disease. After testing, the remainder of those samples were stored until the next round of tests 6 months later. The tests weren't all done at once, of course. But at any given time, there were 23 samples cooling in a fridge in the serology lab. So I pulled some from each of them and sent them to Church. He called me 2 days later. His tone, grave. He asked where I'd gotten so many samples so quickly and what I was getting him into. I told him I wasn't getting him into anything. At most, he was running some DNA tests with no indication of who was being tested or why. And if anyone ever asked me, I hadn't seen or heard of him since we graduated 15 years earlier. I could tell he was still troubled. But after a long silence, he agreed to run the test. The next 5 weeks were excruciating. DNA testing was much slower back then, and I understood he was having to go slower than normal to do it in a clandestine manner. Still, every day, I was constantly waiting for the phone to ring. And when it finally did, I could hardly hear Church over the frantic thudding of my own heart. I asked him to repeat what he had said. The tissue you first sent is a match to sample 17. It's from that person or their identical twin. I thanked him and hung up the phone. I had sent him numbers instead of names on the samples, but I knew whose was whose by heart at this point. Sample 17 belonged to an orthopedic surgeon at the hospital, Marcus Salk. He was a chubby, middle-aged man that was always telling jokes and had a reputation as a good doctor. I didn't know him well, but I had always gotten along with him fine. Why would he do this? My first urge was to find him and torture him until he told me why. I could feel my rage building as the information soaked in. My mind racing to dissect any interaction we had ever had. Any scrap of knowledge I had about him. I thought that he had come to the hospital about 5 years earlier. Was unmarried, had a cat maybe. I realized how little I knew and how I needed to learn more before I committed to an act and either hurt the wrong person or gave them an unintentional means of escape. That's when I began studying Marcus Sock. I weighed my options for learning more about Sock. Trying to become closer to him personally was too risky because if he was actually the man who killed your grandmother, Rebecca, he would be looking at me closely for any signs that I suspected him. I was never an overly social person to begin with. So suddenly trying to buddy up to him would stand out. And I also didn't want to be tied any closer to a person that may soon go missing. Because even at that early stage, I was resolved that when I was sure who took Rebecca from me, I would kill them. In some ways, my lack of equivocation on that point made things easier to plan, but it also meant I had to be extra careful. For instance, using a private investigator to tail him was out. I couldn't have a third party knowing about my interest in Sock. Not even Daniel Church had his name, and his involvement was a necessary evil. Also, what if the PI saw Sock doing something illegal and called the police? I understand how that sounds, but you need to remember that I had no idea what his motive was if he was the killer. Was it an isolated incident or part of something more? The brutality in the transporting of the body to the field pointed towards someone who had possibly killed before, but the inherent risk in taking someone from the place you work, even in a small and isolated parking lot like that, made me wonder if he was either an amateur or at very least impulsive. Also, being honest, I didn't want anyone between me and the person that took her away. That left watching him myself. While I was no expert, I knew I would need 3 basic things: opportunity, ability to observe, and concealment. For opportunity, I slowly shifted my work schedule at the hospital to mirror that of Salt for the most part. This had to be done over the course of a month so I didn't arouse suspicion. Even then, it wasn't perfect as I would be on call at times and I couldn't watch him constantly in even the best of circumstances. Still, I managed to develop a routine of watching him over 40 hours a week, which was the best I could manage by myself. As far as ability to observe, I bought the best binoculars and parabolic mic I could afford along with some tools for getting into places if I needed to. Planning ahead, I also bought a .45 pistol, 5 bundles of rope and 3 rolls of tape, 2 knives, and a stun gun. I wasn't planning to act yet, but I wanted to be prepared just in case. Obviously, I had to get these items over time and with cash only. Concealment was simpler but more expensive. I bought 2 older model cars that were cheap, reliable, and common. I had to look at the number of cars before I found 2 that had no distinctive damage, trim, or color combination that also weren't likely to break down on me. I then found 4 places to park them where they wouldn't be towed so long as they didn't stay in one spot more than a few days. As long as I rotated them a couple of times a week, everything was fine. I considered disguises, but I saw too many pitfalls. If I got pulled over, it would look suspicious. If Sock saw and recognized me in some getup, it would alert him right away when coincidence might explain us intersecting otherwise. I also wanted to keep up with any similar killings that might have occurred, and this was before the World Wide Web, so that meant newspapers. I got a dozen subscriptions from a roughly 500-mile radius around and began pouring through them looking for murders and disappearances. By the time everything was in place, 2 months had passed from when I got the DNA results. The first night I set up down the street from Sock's house, I felt the stir of excitement mixed with my constant sadness and rage. The preparations of the last few weeks had preoccupied my thoughts somewhat, but it had done nothing to ease my sorrow or cool my anger. Sitting in the shadows on that quiet neighborhood street, I strained at every sound and movement like a racehorse waiting for the gate to drop. Just let me have something to confirm what this man had done so I could set to tearing him apart. But, of course, nothing happened that first night or the nights that followed. I would trail him from his home to the store, to the movies, to a coffee shop, where a bored girl 20 years younger than him tried to gamely fend off his awkward flirtations. Between the binoculars and the mic, I could see and hear a surprising amount. And as time went on, I got better at positioning myself at the best angles while hopefully staying inconspicuous. 3 weeks in, and I felt like I knew Sock fairly well. He seemed to be a lonely but harmless man that did nothing out of the ordinary. But, of course, that was outside Sock. I needed to see what inside Sock looked like. I had explored the exterior of Sock's house one day when I knew he wasn't there a month ago, and the safest place to enter seemed to be the back door. I had ordered a pick set in the same model lock as he had, a cheap 4-pin lock with no security pins. I had actually read a book on lock picking when I was a kid, but I had been reading more lately in preparation for this. I practiced on the duplicate lock for hours, mainly using a small tension tool at the bottom along with a rake pick to trigger the pins. I knew the Real lock would be keyed differently, of course. But with practice, I could unlock the dupe in less than 30 seconds. I picked a rare night that he was working and I was not, and then I went to his house. Parking 2 streets over, I cut through backyards quietly, wincing at the bark of a nearby dog. As I crept across his yard and onto his back porch, I had an image of him popping out of the door with a shotgun lowered at his chest. I shook off the thought and crouched down at the door to begin picking. Every scrape of metal sounded enormous in the still night air, and I soaked my shirt with sweat in the 2 minutes it took me to open the lock. Without hesitating, I swung open the door and eased inside. The air inside was stale and cool with a faint smell of cleaning agents and paint the only notable aromas. I was entering through the kitchen, which was very clean but also completely bare. No food. No furniture. Not even appliances aside from an oven that looked rarely used. I knew the house should be unoccupied, but I still moved quietly and made sure that my small flashlight stayed well below any windows. Moving farther into the house, I found empty room after empty room. No furniture or boxes or decorations. Then I reached what I supposed was Sock's bedroom. There was a bare mattress on the floor and a tall standing mirror in one corner. The closet contained a handful of clothes that were the same things I saw him wearing every day. I saw something on the mirror, and I went back to it. It was a picture of Sock, 10 years younger and 50-pound lighter. He was at the beach with a woman, and they were in some kind of joking volleyball jock pose. He looked like he was really happy in the picture, and it lit as I heard the front door click and froze. It was unlikely it could be anyone other than him, and, regardless, I didn't need to be caught in his house. I went to the second closet in the room, fearing I would find it full with items he regularly used. Thankfully, it was empty, and I eased the door closed a moment before he entered. I could see some through the levered closet door, the wooden slats providing the little slashes of vision as he moved around. My heart pounded as he opened the other closet and hung up his jacket before changing clothes. I found out later. He had asked for a half shift at the last minute, which explained how he was home 6 hours early. Apparently, he had decided to make the most of his evening because he was dressing to go back out. In blue jeans and a t-shirt, he looked almost normal except for when you saw his face. It was completely devoid of expression as he silently moved around the room. After putting on different shoes, he stood in front of the mirror, staring at himself, motionless, for several minutes. His stillness was almost mesmerizing. When he finally moved, I almost jumped. He was reaching for the picture, holding it closer and studying it before studying his own face again. His eyes went back and forth as a facsimile of the smile in the picture took form on his face. Watching the expression's slow birth across his lips was weirdly grotesque, but worse was the realization that came with it. He was practicing. He was practicing how he should look when he smiled. As I watched Sulk study himself in the mirror, I kept waiting for some sign he knew I was there. A glance in my direction or some indication he was preparing for a fight, but there was none. He continued to practice smiling for a few more moments, and then he replaced the photo on the mirror and left the room. When I heard the front door open and shut again, I assumed he'd left. But even after I strained and heard what sounded like his car cranking up and driving off outside, I waited a couple of minutes before easing open the closet door. I was tight with tension, with every creak of the floor sounding like a gunshot in my ears. I crept to the back door, constantly looking around for some sign that Sulk had silently doubled back to trick me into thinking he had left. But, no, he seemed to truly be gone. Peeking out the back door window, I made my way out onto the back porch and across his yard. When I was back to my car, I drove around to a street and Sock's car was gone. I had no way of knowing where he had went, but I decided that was okay. While I didn't have definitive evidence he was a killer yet, the strangeness I had observed that night made the idea a lot more credible. Tired, I went home and tried to get some sleep with little luck. 2 days later, I received one of my distant newspaper deliveries. A 20-year-old girl had gone missing the night I had been in Sock's house, and he had left for parts unknown. It was nearly 200 miles away from here. But based on the timeline of when she was last seen, he would have had plenty of time to get there if it was him. Even not knowing if he were to blame, I felt terrible. Responsible. If I had done better, been smarter, I could have stopped him already or at least tracked him so I would know if he had gone to the girl's town or not. As it was, I was left with continuing to observe. That and trying to find out more about Marcus Sock from his past. I pulled his file in the admin office at the hospital and found that prior to coming to our town, he had been at a hospital outside of Olathe, Kansas for a number of years. Not much other information behind his curriculum vitae, which contained nothing out of the ordinary for an orthopedic surgeon. Still, it gave me a jumping-off point. I called the hospital in Kansas and worked my way to someone in human resources, telling them that I was with a large medical practice in Seattle that was considering extending an offer to a former doctor there and was checking through his references as part of the potential hiring process. The woman on the phone was friendly from the start, but I could tell there was a brief hesitation and change of tone when I mentioned the person in question was Dr. Sock. "Well, I can put you in touch with the chief of staff if you want. He was chief back when Marcus was here too, so he can talk more about what kind of doctor he was." But I shouldn't say anything. Her desire to gossip was almost palpable. "I understand. And I'm not trying to put you in a bad spot. But I don't want to make the wrong choice on the guy either, so anything you could tell me would be off the record. But it'd be a big help if you could give me any insight you have into him." There was a moment of contemplative silence, and then she went on. "It's just look. Marcus was a nice guy when he first came here. Right? Joked around a lot. Patients loved him. He had a sweet wife, and he fit right in. Then him and his wife go on vacation to Europe one summer. This was 6 or 7 years ago now. And when they got back, he was different somehow." "Different how?" I asked, trying to keep the intense curiosity out of my voice. I was supposed to be a mildly interested businessman, not an obsessed stalker. I could almost hear her shrug over the phone. "I don't know how to describe it. He was still nice and would joke some, but it seemed forced. He was off from how he had been before. Within a few months, him and his wife were divorced and he had moved away. I guess he's on the move again. Yeah. We'll see. You've given me a lot of food for thought. Hey, was his wife okay? I mean, did everything turn out okay for her?" I could sense her hesitating again, and I was worried I may have pushed for more than she'd give. Luckily, the gossip in her won out as she let out a small sigh. "Yeah. I guess so. Bless her heart. She still lives around here, so I see her from time to time. She doesn't look happy, though. I think Alicia really loved him. And whatever came between them, I think it hurt her a lot. I could feel the rage building in me again as she spoke. Yes. Losing someone you love like that, it kinda destroys you. I thank you. Thank you for your help. You've given me a lot to go on. Don't you want to talk to the chief? I gave a small laugh. I didn't feel no. I think I got what I needed right here. Thank you again. When I hung up the phone, I sat with my head in my hands for some time. My thoughts were swimming in the blackness of my mind like pale, blind, cave fish. I would catch glimpses of their pallid scales and hear the occasional ripple or splash as they stirred the water, but these ghost impressions left me with little in the way of a solid idea or plan. The things that felt most real to me were my pain and my anger, and it was getting harder to hold them in check. This was the part 1 of the story. Please subscribe and press the bell icon for part 2 of the story.